The stream of people coming in has slowed down, so I'll get us started here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Johanna Murray. I'm the Extension Coordinator for Peace Country Beef and Forage Association, and I've been working with Caitlin from Country Junction Feeds to put this webinar on and get everything all organized. So thank you all for coming out tonight, or staying in and tuning in, as the case may be. Couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. A little bit background on Peace Country Beef and Forage Association. We are a research and extension group, non-for-profit. We were founded in 1982 by a group of producers, and we serve 10 municipalities in northern Alberta here. We do research on our farm site in Fairview. We also do work on some satellite sites and on-farm trials. We also do extension events. We have monthly and biannual publications with our research information in them. And we also have a biweekly podcast called Coffee, Cows, and Crops, which we don't have a ton of sheep content on there yet, unfortunately, but we do have some good information about growing feed and that sort of stuff. So that's all of our contact information if you want to find us. Country Junction Feeds is our partner for tonight. They specialize in bagged bulk feeds, bagged and bulk feeds for beef, dairy, equine, poultry, swine, and of course goats and sheep, which we'll be discussing tonight. And Jamie McAllister, our speaker, is a ruminant nutritionist. He's got a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, Animal Nutrition, and Economics, and he's got 34 years of experience working in that field. So I think that's kind of all I have to say. I will stop sharing my screen here and we'll get Jamie set up and ready to go.
Oh, they do.
Looks good.
Well, I'm impressed. I'm kind of old and I haven't got much to do on Friday night, so that's my excuse, but I'm quite impressed that many people would join in to hear me talk, so it's great. I was just looking up the day length hours where I live, which is in Stony Plain, and I enjoy just about 45 minutes more daylight than you guys do up north. So, but of course you're down to about less than 7 hours. So the talk tonight I'm going to give is called Small Ruminant Nutrition and Marketing. Obviously you can tell by my font size that it's mostly going to be on nutrition and not a bunch on marketing. So before I give any sort of nutrition talks, I always like to start off talking about what a ruminant is, because this is what makes sheep, goats, and other ruminants really special. So this is the digestive tract of a ruminant, and what ruminant means is that they have 4 stomachs. So the first stomach is called the rumen, and then the second stomach is called the reticulum, and then they have what's called the abomasum and the omasum. So the rumen basically is a giant storage pouch, and it's also a giant fermentation vat. That means lots of fermentation goes on in there. The reticulum is part of it as well. Kind of the main function of the reticulum is that, well, this next slide is probably better. So what happens when the food comes down? It can go into the rumen or the reticulum, and probably the heavier, denser type material goes into the reticulum. And that's also the spot where the animal chews its cud from. So any longer particles regurgitated out of the reticulum. So from the reticulum, interestingly enough, is also if you get hardware disease, that's where all the heavy metal objects fall into, would be the reticulum. So if we get a hardware problem, that's the part of the rumen that's involved. The third stomach in a rumen, it's called the omasum, and what the omasum does basically is it absorbs a lot of water that comes out of the digestion and that, and then they have an abomasum, and an abomasum is a lot like a monogastric stomach or our stomach, so it performs digestion by acids and enzymes, just the way we would break down food. So this is just a picture of the digestive tract of a ruminant. So basically the flow of the feed comes from the mouth down the esophagus into the rumen or the reticulum, and then it's digested in there, travels from there through the abomasum or the omasum to the abomasum, then on down the intestines. So this is a schematic of what's really going on within the rumen. Like the rumen's basically comprised of millions and billions and billions of what we call rumen microbes. They're made up of bacteria, protozoa, and fungi. There's specific bacteria that digest basically fiber particles, so fiber digesters. There's bacteria that digest starch particles. There's bacteria that digest protein. They all work together and they're all needed in order to digest the forage. So a feed particle comes into the rumen. They're colonized by all these different types of microbes, and then all the microbes start to break down the feed, and then other microbes join in the process, and then it's just one big continuous symbiotic relationship with the microbes. This is just showing what's going on in the actual bacteria. So what's required by the bacteria? They require an energy source, so feed. They require a protein source, and the protein can either be true protein or it can be ammonia. Like certain bacteria actually just have ammonia requirements. So the bacteria, as they digest the feed, they break down the particles, and then they release, from the process of digestion, they release ammonia, more energy, and then more of these are retained in the rumen, and the cycle just continues. So what is the really neat thing about a rumen is that it can take materials that is really undigestible to us and high fiber type stuff, and it breaks it down into a highly digestible or highly nutritious product for us in the form of milk and meat. So that's what really makes a ruminant special. So this is what happens in the rumen. Now I know this is a cow, but basically if we take all them numbers and divide it by 10, it's going to be pretty close to what goes on in sheep and goats. So we've got say a couple 100 grams to 3 kilograms of dry matter, so that's feed entering the rumen. Along with that, we need 2 to 8 liters of water. Now water doesn't get talked about a lot as a nutrient, but it's the most important nutrient, or certainly twice as much water is required as the feed dry matter, I guess you would say. Along in this process, we also have 5 to 15 liters of saliva produce. So where does the saliva come from? Well, it comes from saliva glands that are within the rumen, and it's stimulated by the cud chewing of the cow. That's another reason why they chew their cuds. So why do we require the saliva? The main reason we require saliva is because one of the byproducts that come off of the digestion of the fermentation within the rumen is called VFAs, or volatile fatty acids. So the term acid means high capabilities, lower in pH, right? As opposed to a base. So an acid will lower the pH. The rumen needs a stable pH environment. Like if the pH drops in the rumen, then it basically kills everything off. So we need to maintain basically a 6 to a 6.8 pH in the rumen. Saliva is how it's done. That's how it's buffered. These VFAs are actually absorbed out of the rumen, and these are the energy that the animal uses. So most of the energy that comes from these, most of the energy required by the animal actually comes from this VFAs. Other byproducts coming out are microbial cells. So as the bacteria do the digestion, they're continuously sloughing some out of the rumen as well. And these microbial cells, actually the ruminant uses that to digest in the abomasum for a nutrition source. A byproduct of fermentation is also gas, and it's in the form of methane and CO2. And these would be the two gases that I guess the climate alarmists or the environmentalists are concerned about. I'm not going to say a lot about them other than what we put into the rumen does affect how much gas is produced. There's ways of producing less gas. So this is these are the main VFAs, or volatile fatty acids, that are produced under sort of a forage digestion, and there's 3 main ones. One's called acetate. The other one's called propionate, and one called butyrate. So these are kind of the main volatile acids that are produced from the fermentation, and they actually supply the majority of the energy that's required by the cow. Changes to it, like a forage, like a normal forage type diet, you get more acetate and butyrate. If we change that over to more of a grain type diet, you get more propionate produced. Now, on the way of conversion from these volatile fatty acids to ultimately glucose, which is the ultimate energy source of the animal, propionate happens to be utilized more efficiently, happens to produce less gas. So that's why when we feed a more of a grain diet, we get better efficiency of growth and production on the animal. So microbial protein, which is basically all the bacteria and protozoa floating down out of the rumen, they are like 80% protein. So from this protein, it's digested in the abomasum, it becomes the protein source for the animal in order to utilize. So it's 80% true protein and it's 80% digestible, which is a high digestibility. The other really neat thing about the microbial protein is, you know, animals require protein, but more specifically, they require amino acids, right? The building blocks of protein. And it just so happens that the microbes are an ideal protein source, meaning an ideal balance of amino acids for the animal. So it's really quite an awesome system that's been produced here. Supply a large portion of the protein requirements of the ruminant animal. Basically supply all the protein requirements of a ruminant animal, depending on how much gain they're doing. This is just a couple of what I call neat slides. So this is an electron microscope picture of feed particles. And the one it's on my left here, this one, that's actually a particle of grain being digested by the different bacteria, protozoa, fungi. And then the one on the right, that's a corn silage. That's a husk of a corn silage. And it just shows the same thing being broken down by the bacteria within the rumen. I didn't really say the function of fungi, but basically we think the fungi are in there to help break down the more fibrous type particles. They sort of break it apart as they grow, is what the fungi are for. Protozoa, little hard to know exactly what their function is. The only thing we know is that protozoa are an awful lot bigger than bacteria. So it's just the amount of biomass coming out of the rumen. A lot of it's actually protozoa just based on the size of them. Okay, so we've hit the actual nutrition section here a little bit. So when we talk about ruminant nutrition, we always talk about stuff in dry matter. The reason we do that is because it allows us to compare different forages, so we can compare a hay with a silage, for example. But the reason we care about dry matter also is that dry matter, like the intake of feed, is really what drives the system. The more intake we can have, or the more digestible the intake, the more production we can get. So in general, we measure things as a percent of body weight. So in general, ewes consume between 2 and 4% of their body weight as dry matter. Down at the low end, 2%, we think of ewes that are very pregnant, so carrying twins. A lot of rumen capacity is reduced, so they haven't got as much room for intake. Because basically intake is within the rumens probably driven mostly by rumen fill. So when the rumen becomes full, that's when intake ceases. We can also get really low dry matter intakes on poor quality forages. And that's more of a function of rumen fill happens sooner because it takes a long time to break it down. It doesn't pass out of the rumen soon enough, so animals eat less. And then on the high end of the intake end, 4% with lactation. So no more rumen squishing there. Their rumen's got capacity, and also milk production. And it's true that with higher milk production will drive intake. They will eat more. So what are the requirements? Like how do we figure out nutritional requirements of ewes? there's a few sources called the nutrient requirements of sheep. So it's the NRC nutrient requirements. This is quite an old one. So this is talking about a late gestation ewe, so the last month before she lambs. And it's saying that she has twin lambs, so it's figuring out the energy value required based off of having twins. Then I've got a range of body weights here. Predicted dry matter intake in pounds. TDN, that's just an energy value. So TDN is what we're using to calculate how much energy they require. Basically, TDN is total digestible nutrients, which in all fiber sources, it's basically an equation derived off of how much fiber is in it. And then from grain source, it's an equation determined from basically the capacity of the energy portion less the fiber portion in grain that's not very digestible, and then less the ash or mineral portion that doesn't contribute to the energy.
Just quickly, Jamie.
Yeah.
Is the dry matter intake similar in goat does to ewes?
Well, amazingly enough, as a percentage of body weight, I believe the answer is yes. But I did separate out the goats on some slides down here a little bit further.
Awesome. We'll be patient.
Do you know how to get the, like I've got this taskbar across my top here that's cutting out some of my slide. Or maybe somebody can read what it says for me across the top here.
Sure. It says a 175-pound ewe requires 2.65 pounds TDN, 0.53 pounds of protein on a 4.3 pound dry matter intake.
Very
Equals.
good.
Yeah.
Equals. Okay, so what I've done is, so there's so much TDN, right?
Yeah.
So much protein. So you take the dry matter intake, which was 4.3 pounds. Is that what we said?
That's
yeah,
right.
So 4.3 pounds of dry matter intake divided by average hay of 0.86% dry matter gives you 5 pounds of high quality hay. So 5 pounds of hay will meet the nutritional requirements of this 175-pound ewe. The protein, what did it say? 0.53 pounds of protein?
Yep.
Okay, so then it would be 0.53 pounds of protein divided by 4.5 pounds of dry matter, which works out to the 12.3% protein is what the hay has to be for protein in order to meet the nutrition requirements for hay, right? So I don't know, like quality wise, this is actually a pretty good hay, eh? Like I don't know, it would be cut, like if it was an alfalfa hay, it would be cut kind of early July-ish in order to get that kind of energy value in it. So it's a pretty good hay. Option 2, so I've got 4.5 pounds of average quality hay and half a pound of barley. Will also meet the nutrient requirements, so that would be option number 2. I guess I should say, like all these dry matters I'm predicting are very important, but what's most important is to actually know what the dry matter intake of your animals are. Like these are predictions, they can be different. And if the dry matter intake's different, meaning lower or higher, it changes all these quantities that they require, right? So that also balances this ewe ration. And then do we have enough protein? The answer is kind of the same, because we know that barley somewhere around 12% protein, so we would need a 12% protein hay in this case in order to balance it as well. Option 3 would be 10 pounds of corn silage. And in this case, I assume the corn silage was 40% dry matter. So if you take your 4.5 pounds and divide it by 0.4, that means that they have to eat 10 pounds of corn silage as fed. Now I'm assuming this corn silage is really good energy, so it meets energy requirements that way, but corn silage also happens to be quite low in protein. So that's why we need to add 0.4 pounds of protein in order to meet the requirements of this ewe. Interestingly enough, on the protein side of things, one of the first signs in a ruminant that the protein could be short is they don't eat the dry matter that you expect them to. So in this case, what I think would probably happen is you'd find your ewes would only consume about 8 pounds of dry matter or 8 pounds of corn silage as fed. So they just simply wouldn't eat enough to meet their energy value either. But as soon as we added the protein in, we get the rumen circulating, cooking enough, digesting quicker. bit more passage rate, and then they'd eat a bit more. So that's what protein really does in a ruminant. Option 4, kind of a different take on things, but I've got a guy that this is actually how we feed our ewes, because he hasn't got a lot of land base and he kind of utilizes quite a bit of pea straw. So option 4 is a 2 1/4 pounds of pea straw, 1.57 pounds of barley per head per day, and 0.5 pounds of canola. And this also balances the 175 pound ewe for maintenance, carrying twins. So basically, it's not really about what type of feed we're using, it's more about how the balance is. Option 4 certainly would take some more management than some of the other options too, because not all pea straw is created equal, and we're starting to push the concentrate side here, which does have some issues or some possibilities as far as rumen function goes. So then we switch it up to a lactating ewe. Again, we're assuming that they're twins. If you notice here, what happens to dry matter intake? It went from, I think it was 4.5 pounds there. Well, it was actually 4.5 pounds there. So if the ewe was still 175 after she lambed, which she wouldn't be, because they lose about 20 pounds or so from the product's conception rate, but the intake goes up that much. So we'll go to a 150 pound ewe. No, you're gonna have to read the top of the screen for me again. So 150 pound ewe requires
requires 3.77 pounds of TDN.
So a lot more TDN.
Yeah, and 0.95 pounds protein.
Darn near double the protein.
On a 6.1 pound dry matter intake.
But fortunately, your dry matter intake goes up a couple of pounds, so that helps us out. So if you boil them numbers down, it works out that they need to have a 0.618 TDN, so a 61.8% TDN, and 15.5% crude protein in the final ration of the dry matter. So then I'm running through same options again to see what does it take in order to meet the requirements of this ewe. We find that it's 7 pounds of a high quality hay, of which high quality hay is more than 61.8 TDN and more than 15.5% protein. So if you got that, great, you can feed them 7 pounds of hay. Option number 2 would be 5 pounds of average quality hay, 2 pounds of barley, and then we kind of have to decide whether we need some added protein or not. And the answer in this case is likely yes, we do, because that hay would have to be 16% protein or somewhere thereabouts in order to meet the protein requirements. So more than likely, we do have to add some protein into this diet. And then option 3, 12.5 pounds of corn silage and 1.25 pounds of canola meal. And option 4, and this one gets actually quite a bit trickier on lactating ewes, because you notice our barley number and our canola meal number have to go up a lot in order to balance the requirements of it. So that this is getting to be a pretty concentrated ration. Might be fairly hard to manage from a rumen standpoint, but would balance them for requirements. Okay, so switching up into lambs now. So in general, lambs consume between 3 and 5% of their body weight as dry matter. Down as low as 3% would mean heavy lambs, not too far from finish, or grass-fed lambs, and it becomes more of a moisture issue in the silage or in the grass. Like the grass is too wet, they have a hard time consuming enough dry matter in order to drive the requirements. Probably also the reason why lambs just out on pasture, out on grass, don't gain the best. Or if we added a bit of a supplemental grain to them, they would gain quite a bit better, because the constraints of not a huge rumen, not a huge capacity for dry matter intake, and the grass is pretty wet. Highest body weight intake would be small lambs on a creep ration with high grain potential. So that would be 20 times 5 would be 1, so kind of a 1 pound intake on a 20 pound lamb. So 1 pound of creep feed intake on a 20 pound lamb would be that sort of intake. So these are the NRC requirements for lambs. anywhere from 5 to 3.4% intake. And of course, as they get bigger, their amount of dry matter goes up. So does the amount of protein and everything else go up, right? But as a percentage, the protein will actually start to come down because there's more intake to have the protein within. And my top's cut off again, but it probably says something to the effect that lambs, if you want maximum growth on, are somewhere around 76 to 80 TDN and somewhere between a 14 and 18% crude protein. So basically, if you want lambs to gain to their full potential, they have to be on a high grain and a high protein ration. And typically we talk about 18% starting rations from the beginning to like 30 pounds, 40 pounds, 16% grower ration, which would be up to about 60, 70 pounds, and then a 14% finisher, which would take them on up to finish. This is just a conversation on what are the best feed types, or what seems to be the best feed types to feed lambs. Whole grains and a pelleted supplement. So whole barley and a pelleted supplement in with it is the best gains. And the reason why it gives you best gains is it seems like with the whole grains, they don't digest as quick. They're able to keep the pH of the rumen better. Don't need as much, if any, forage added to these diets. And then as a consequence of not having a little bit of forage in there diluting the energy value out, they gain better. Sorting can be an issue with these diets. Depending on the lambs and all, they can be awesome sorters and sort for the grain against the pellets or the pellets against the grain. And basically you need a way of mixing these ingredients together in a consistent manner. So most of these type of rations, they usually got a little mixer mill that they're mixing them up in and then feeding them out with an auger. Another type of rations would be the pelleted type rations, and these are the ones that I would make at the feed mill. They're convenient feed, and they're balanced, of course. Kind of the difference with them is that they're all pretty finely processed before I pellet them. So the digestibility or the speed of digestibility goes up. So you still need to feed some forage with these pelleted rations in order to maintain rumen stability. And it's probably somewhere around a half a pound or so of forage is what you would need. Then there's, of course, rolled ground mash rations. They give quite a bit more flexibility on protein choices and economics of protein choices. Like if you can buy mash bulk proteins, you can often buy them cheaper. Not typically, ruminants are not a big fan of fines, so usually the intake drops, but the cost of these, of course, could be attractive. Like the actual cost per ton could be less. This is sort of switching into the marketing portion here now. I love this graph where it says at the bottom here, due to differences among auctions, prices are reported as trends rather than averages, which is awful true. If you go and I went and looked at some Beaver Hill numbers, and man, the price can range from $1 a pound very, very quickly, depending on the week and the size and the time and all that sort of thing. So what can we learn from the market trend here, I guess would be the question. I'm looking at the red line here, which is the 5-year average. So probably what we can say is the price of lambs starting in March starts to trend upwards, and it trends up pretty good into about the end of June, early July. And I think it's a combination of lack of supply here that's starting an increase in demand that's starting to drive it up, and then demand drives it up more into the Easter season. And then what happens in July, I think, is probably the supply starts to catch up from all the lambs coming on from being born in December, January. And then the price starts to slide off a little bit from the summer. And then as we get into the fall, it slides off more, and it's a combination of demand dropping off and supply dropping off as well. And then we get a little peak around Christmas time here, and that's probably more of a ethnic market wanting to buy lamb around Christmas. So we're getting a little bit of a spike in prices here. You're probably all aware of what happened this year. So that's this line here. So prices were actually cooking along quite nicely until about May. And do we all know what happened in May? The plant in Innisfail, also known as Nelco, are big suppliers into the lamb market, but they started to get in a bit of trouble here. So they started to dump excess a number of lambs onto the market. And it doesn't like it. The big thing with the lamb market is kind of the Eastern Canada sort of sets it, right? Like the big demands out in Eastern Canada. So they were flooding all markets, and that's what really dropped the price off hard. And of course, it's been kind of trending down ever since until they sort of figure out what's going to happen with all the uncertainty going on in the marketplace. I've heard that there is a buyer for the plant. I've heard it's a company from Quebec, and I heard that they are a lamb and a veal processor. So it could be all right if they buy it and start processing lambs there again. One of the issues I sort of wonder about is I hear they also bought the feedlots, so they will have their own supply of lambs as well. But I don't think they're going to be as big an integrator as what Nelco was. So hopefully there's a bit more room in the market for others as well. Oh, so I guess this is just general on what markets do you want to hit that I can't read the top of my slide again anyway. But you have to know what markets and what market weight are most desirable to sell into. So obviously it becomes more of a spring market. I looked at the price of fats. They hit a high in May 21 of $3.18 per pound. They didn't trend quite that high this year, so it's probably maybe not a little bigger supply perhaps, or a little less demand. But the high I saw was $3.18 in May of 21, and the low was $1.38 in September of 22. Well, we just went through what happened there. Just interestingly enough, in May of 21, a 55-pound lamb at that time was also at $4.30 a pound is what it was worth. And 70-pound lambs were at $3.80. So the question becomes, what was the cost of the extra 55 or 40 pounds of extra gain, right? Because if you do the math, which I got my cheat sheet here. So basically that 110-pound lamb was worth $350 a head. The 70-pound lamb was worth $266 a head, and the 55-pound lamb was worth $236.50 a head. So you've got a spread anywhere from 110 to $80 a head, which if you do the math, it's basically 55 or 40 pounds of gain that you could have put on them extra, right? So what we want to know is, was it worth putting on that extra gain or not? And if you do the math on it, the cost of gain had to be about $2 a pound or less, or it wasn't worth it. So I just looked up my lamb ration. 3.5 pounds of lamb ration would have cost you 75 cents. So on these particular lambs and that cost, they would have had to be gaining more than 0.37 pounds a day, or it wouldn't have been worth doing. The growth rate on lambs is highly variable. Some will do way better in this, and some will not do that amount. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe depending on the gain and the cost, it might be worthwhile to sell them into a lighter market. So the overall question is then, how much gain do we need to have lambs to meet the desirable market weight at the desired time, and what is the cost of that gain? So how do we achieve our goals when feeding ruminants, I think is what that says up at the top there. So basically it's a combination of feeding the correct amount of grain and forage at the right time, because we can vary grains greatly depending on how much forage and grain we feed. But ultimately, the most important thing is keeping the rumen happy by maintaining a consistent environment. Rumens like things boring. The more boring, the better. The more consistent, the better. This is just, you've always heard that any changes you do in ruminants, you make the changes really slow, right? Well, this is just a slide that drives home that point. So it takes time for the different types of bacteria and stuff to adapt to what the diet is. You can see some of them adapt pretty quick, a couple days, some are more on the fiber digestion side of things. And then some of them, like some specific protozoa, way out to 12 to 20 days before they adapt. So the overall message here is any changes we have to make really slow because it takes a long time for them to adapt. Whoops. Goats. We're on the goat subject. So basically the difference between goats and sheep are in general, goats are browsers when they're left in a natural state. So what that means is they're more interested in leaves, twigs, upper foliage on plants and stuff. And usually if they're left on their own to browse, they'll browse kind of the higher nutritious part of the plants. And the reason they do that is because we think the rate of passage out of the rumen is faster in goats. So more nutrition part of the plants, higher digestibility, they get more nutrients out of it. Whereas when we put them on kind of the more traditional type, lower energy type forages like pasture or hay, they're not quite as efficient at utilizing it because the rate of passage out of the rumen is a little quicker. The other thing I know about goats is it seems like their survival ability is a lot better on poorer diets. So you can feed goats some fairly poor forage and they will survive okay, just as long as we're not trying to make them do a lot of performance. They're pretty good at existing on lower quality forages. Goats have a lower potential for lean muscle gain, so meat production is less efficient. And of course, milk production, depending on the goat, whether it's a dairy goat or a meat goat, can be a way different story. We can get a lot of milk production out of goats. We also know that goats are less cold tolerant, so they often need some shelter or some environmental protection in the winter. So here we are with the daily nutrient requirements of meat producing goats. And I found this, it's another NRC for goats. So we've got young goats requirements here, different sizes. And then we got does in the different states of pregnancy. Now 130-pound doe, I don't think that's a really big doe, but we're going to use her. So a late gestation goat requires 62% TDN and 12 protein and a 4.5 pound of dry matter. So I guess that's a little bit more intake on a goat than what it was on the sheep, but also a little higher rate of passage. So the overall nutrient value they get out of it a little bit lower, which is probably why they have to eat a little bit more. Anyway, so what does this is 4.5 pounds of a 58 TDN hay and 0.5 pound of grain. Probably more thinking about the grain in cold weather and stuff as well. And of course, this could maybe need some added protein depending on what the quality of the hay is. Lactating does, the requirement there, it said is 63 TDN, 40% protein, and 4.9 pounds of dry matter. So this could be covered by 4.25 pounds of 58% TDN hay. 1 pound of barley grain and 0.5 pound of canola meal would balance this ration. And of course, the higher the milk production, the higher the energy and protein requirements will be. So talking about kids, anything I've read, or I've actually owned some kids over the years and did the numbers on what they gain. usually the best gains I could get on average was about a third of a pound a day. So this is why the potential to gain is between 0.25 and 0.5 pounds a day. And as a consequence of their lower potential for average daily gain, their actual requirements are lower than what lambs are. So at a 30-pound body weight, we know that they require 16% protein and 68 TDN and 2 pounds of dry matter. So this would be like feeding 1 pound of an 18% goat ration with 1.3 pounds of 11% protein hay, or 1 pound of a 16% goat ration is 1.3 pounds of 13% protein hay. So if the hay's better, you can get away with a little less protein in the ration and vice versa, right? The other thing I know about kids, goats as well, are tremendous sorters. I did a lot of stuff trying to get them on the whole grain and pelleted supplement as well, but it didn't work very well. They sorted for the grain or against the grain, and for the supplement, most times it was for the grain and against the supplement. So obviously the ration became quite deficient in protein because they weren't eating it. So I recommend pelleted rations for goats, just have the uniformity and not get the sorting. Perhaps a uniform mash would work. Like if the particle size was all pretty uniform, they might not be able to sort it as well as they can whole barley in a pelleted supplement. Marketing of goats, I know the best market price are situated around special economic holidays. I looked on Beaver Hill on these guys too, and goats, the prices actually holds pretty steady year round, but there's quite a variety in how many hit the market, eh? So I think hitting the market with quite a few at the ethnic holidays, so the price stays up, and then fewer hitting the market on the non-holidays, so the price stays up anyway. So goat price looks pretty consistent. General comment section. So up until now, I've been yapping about just basically energy and protein as the requirements for small ruminants, but it's not true that the only requirements are protein and energy. All small ruminants also require the correct balance of macro minerals, and all macro minerals means is minerals that are required in higher amounts. And specifically, the macro minerals we're interested in is calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium chloride, also known as salt, potassium, and sulfur. So them are the main macro minerals that we're looking at and interested. I'll say a bit about calcium and phosphorus a little bit later. We also know that all small ruminants require the correct balance of trace minerals. So trace minerals just means minerals required in smaller amounts. The trace minerals we're interested in are zinc, manganese, copper, iodine, cobalt, and selenium. So them are the main trace minerals that we're interested in. Probably one of the key ones that gets talked about a lot in sheep nutrition is copper. Copper toxicity is quite a problem. Copper, or sheep do not require do not tolerate high copper levels. So some of the, like my trouble becomes, I have to be very careful on the copper levels of the byproducts that I'm buying in to make rations out of. Some of them can get up pretty high and actually too high for lambs. Like the kind of the rules are somewhere around maybe 7 to 10 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter of copper in the forages or the grains or whatever the components are, is about as high a level as lambs can take. Now there's certainly breed differences and better tolerance within some breeds, but overall copper we have to be quite concerned about. The only thing that it's kind of weird, like normally there's another trace mineral that's called molybdenum. And normally we're worried about molybdenum being too much and interfering with copper and anything that requires copper. But in lambs, it can actually be an advantage to have a little higher molybdenum in the forage because it ties up the copper and makes it not available. All small ruminants require fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamin A, D, and E. Now, the other neat thing about bacteria in the rumen is they actually produce B vitamins. So all B vitamins and vitamin K are physically produced by bacteria within the rumen. So us being monogastrics have requirements for B vitamins as well. We don't get enough out of our, or we have to get a supplemental source out of our diet. Ruminants don't, because the bacteria actually make them form. So that's another neat thing about the ruminant system. Just sort of closing with some general comments that are relative to both sheep and goats. I think it says parasites up at the top there, right? So parasites, worms, big problem in small ruminants. Like, thought process would be that maybe sheep are a bit more adapted because they're used to be in lower grazers, where the higher grazing goats made to graze low might get a bit more worm infestation, that sort of thing. But overall, they're a problem. Best to talk to a vet about the best dewormer, because I know there's all sorts of differences in dewormers as far as how well they kill the worms, or efficacy, how well they work. And then there's starting to become quite a few resistance issues, meaning the different antihelminthics are called, they're the dewormers. Some of the worms are becoming resistant to them. So I know some cases you need to change it up. Another problem that's common to both goats and lambs is coccidiosis. And this, from a feed company standpoint, this is something that we can do something about. So these three products are called Coccidiostats in general, and then Monensin and Lasaliside are also classified as ionophores. There's a publication called the Canadian Medication Ingredients Brochure, which regulates what the feed industry can put in for medications in the feed. So from that brochure, their Decox, we're allowed to put it into lambs for the prevention of coccidiosis, and the dose we're allowed to feed is 0.5 milligrams of dequinate, the actual active ingredient in Decox, per kilogram of body weight. So that we can put in, and we don't require a vet script or anything to do that. But it's just lambs. So if we want to put Decox into goats, we would still need a vet script to do it. Monensin sodium, more common name that's been around forever, is Rumensin. So this is an ionophore, which just happens to be effective against coccidiosis as well. It's currently cleared for sheep and goats. And then the level that we put in rations is 11 to 22 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter for the prevention of coccidiosis. The no-no on this, or what we'd have to put on all labels, is do not feed to any lactating small ruminants. Not that it's probably an issue, but they have to put that on there because the companies that make it probably haven't done any research to say if it goes into the milk and that sort of thing. Lasaliside sodium, which is Bovatec, is another ionophore, and it's for lambs only. And the dose of that's 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight for the prevention of coccidiosis. And the only thing to note on Bovatec is that it's got a 2-day meat withdrawal on it. CFIA, for some reason, just put a 2-day meat withdrawal on it, so you'd have to redraw it 2 days before you send them for slaughter. A couple of points. You notice that all these guys are for prevention of coccidiosis. So if you've actually got an outbreak of coccidiosis, you have to treat it. These guys will not help when the coccidia is far enough down the cycle where you actually got an outbreak of it. Things like amprolium, or used to be sulfa drugs, is what you'd use for treatment. The difference between these three is, like, Decox gives the lambs an efficiency and a gain advantage when under the presence of coccidiosis. Monensin and Lasaliside, or Rumensin and Bovatec, not only prevent them from getting coccidiosis, but they also improve efficiency because they're called ionophores. And what ionophores do in the rumen is they actually change the end pathway of the volatile fatty acids from acetate and more channel it towards propionate. And like I said earlier, propionate is more efficiently utilized for making ultimately glucose. So that's why you'll see a feed efficiency claim with Monensin and Lasaliside too. What's the difference between these two products? Lasaliside, I would say, is probably a safer product as far as dose goes. Like Rumensin, you can get the dose up pretty, not like it's easier to get Monensin kind of toxic getting a dose too high than it is Lacellacid. Cost wise, just because you're feeding less of Monensin, it'd be a little bit less than Lacellacid. The only sort of caution, well, I don't know if it's a caution, but I do know like these guys, they also have an effect on copper. Like sometimes, well, some of the thoughts are that maybe Monensin and Lacellacid have an effect on the protozoa within the rumen. And the protozoa are thought to maybe take up some excess copper and flush it out of the system, so it's not as toxic to the actual sheep. So if we have an effect on the protozoa, we might not get as much copper flushing out of the system. It's not a case at these lower levels, but as they get to higher levels, it could be more of an issue for sure. Enterotoxemia, also known as, and this is a big problem in feeding lambs, goats, kids. It's also known as overeating disease, but basically it's caused by an intestinal growth of a bacteria called Clostridium perfringens. And this bacteria, it's sort of like any bacteria, if you're fed high levels of nutrients and not under control, they grow rapid, faster. And this bacteria happens to produce a toxin that poisons the host animal. So ultimately, why they die from enterotoxemia is because of this toxin. The cause of it is usually an excess or too quick intake of either milk, like any readily available energy source, or grain. It's like any disease that's complicated by environmental or internal stressors, like anytime weather stress, sickness, parasites, it all makes the disease worse. Change in feed too fast. Best prevented by the clostridial vaccinations. Usually of the using does prior to parturition will give some immunity to the lambs through the colostrum, and then usually we need to do the lambs and kids again, and then possibly again in the feeding period. Urinary caniculi. So it's also known as water belly. It's actually caused by phosphate salt. So it's actually too high of a phosphorus is what causes it. So these phosphate salts form and they get lodged in the urinary tract of male lambs and kids. It's worse in wethers or castrates because basically the urethra is smaller as opposed to more mature advanced males. Yeah, so when you castrate them, does make a difference on water belly for sure. So it's really caused by an imbalance of calcium to phosphorus in the ration. So it's high phosphorus, low calcium, which is exactly what grain-based diets are. Like, just for an example, barley is 0.04% calcium, so really low in calcium, and it's 0.4% phosphorus, which is quite high in phosphorus. So feeding a straight barley diet without any supplemental calcium will cause water belly. And what you need to do in the ration is you need to maintain at least a 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. Ammonium chloride, which what it does is it'll actually break down the phosphate salt. It's an acid that'll break down the salts. Will help with preventing water belly, but it's not a substitute for calcium to phosphorus ratios to begin with. Well, that's it for me. You can tell where my focus is now. I'm a new grandpa. I've been a grandpa for about 2 months now. This is my grandson Josiah. You can see he's got the nice little sheep shirt on.
Right on.
I hope you had fun like this guy.
There you go. All right. I'll give you a straightforward one first. Can you talk about vitamins in stored feed in hay and stuff? And
Sure.
Do they persist in there and that sort of stuff?
Yeah. There's no doubt that like the story goes, green pasture is sufficient in vitamin A, D, and E, usually quite a good source of vitamin A, D, and E in green pastures. So lots of times, if I'm asked, do I have to feed vitamins in the summer? most of my, like my summer minerals, most of them, no, I do not have vitamins in them. Although the sheep one, I don't make two different kinds, so yes, it does. But the technical answer is in fresh pasture and forage, the vitamins are sufficient in it. As it dries down into later pasture, the vitamin content does go down in it, but there's still some present. Dry hay, kind of the same thing. There's still some present, but over time, as we store it, the levels do drop. So recommend some vitamin supplementation with dry hay, although technically you probably don't need as much as if you're on a silage program, because within the silage, the fermentation of the feed itself destroys all the vitamins out of it. So the amount of vitamins in fermented forages is zilch. So definitely add there for sure.
Awesome.
There is a couple, like I said, all B vitamins were produced in the rumen in order to cover requirements, but there is a couple situations where there's a couple of B vitamins that could possibly require too. One's thiamine, and basically thiamine's required on feedlot situations where high grain diets will actually produce what's called a thiaminase enzyme that'll start to destroy some thiamine out of the rumen. So it's manufactured, but it's destroyed before the animal gets it. And then the other thing that really factors into that is if we got high sulfates in the water. So that's the case where a B vitamin is actually required. What happens if we get too little of thiamine? It's called poliencephalomalacia. So it's the old brain disease where they got their head cocked back and don't know what they're doing. I've seen it in a couple of lamb feedlots that I deal with. I have to feed thiamine in. Anyway, too much detail perhaps, but
all good information to have.
All good information.
Yeah. Jumping back to protein, I had a couple different questions. So we'll start with this one. Can you talk a little bit about using urea or non-protein nitrogen in the case of having just old pasture like dry grass and that sort of stuff? Could you use it for dry does or finisher lambs or kids or any of that sort of stuff for unmature pasture?
Oh boy, yeah, urea is a tricky one. Like I made the statement that there's certain bacteria that require, like urea goes to ammonia in the rumen, right? So it's not a true protein, but it's a nitrogen source. So I made the statement a while ago that said there's actually some, well, I don't know if I said it or not, but there's actually certain bacteria in the rumen that the requirements for ammonia, they require ammonia. And interestingly enough, quite a few of these bacteria that actually require the ammonia are the fiber digestion type bacteria. The trouble with urea is, yes, ruminants will use it as a protein source, but you also need an energy source available in order to drive it into the microbial protein. If you haven't got the energy source in it to drive it into microbial protein, you get, remember the little slide where it had the NH3 coming off again? If you haven't got the energy there to drive it into protein, the NH3 builds up too much and you get what's called ammonia toxicity. So the question becomes with the pasture, is there enough digestible carbohydrate in it in order to utilize the urea on pasture? And I think my answer would be, I would probably be comfortable with a little bit, but not a large portion of the requirements. It's kind of the same in lambs. Like lambs urea seems to be okay when they're about 70 pounds or so. And I think it's the same thing. I think they have to have enough rumen capacity and eat enough carbohydrates in order to utilize it. And it seems like before that size, they just don't utilize it well. And the ammonia toxicity has shown up. I know it was several years ago that I was doing the feedlot and I wasn't using any urea in the protein source, because we were feeding lambs from like 30 pounds right up to finish, and we just had the one supplement. Well, an outfit came in with a price that was quite a bit lower than mine because they'd stuck some urea in it. And of course, if you add urea into a supplement, the price drops quite a bit. But what in fact happened is we did see some ammonia toxicity, especially in the smaller lambs that weren't eating enough. So be cautious, I guess, is what I would say. A little bit, but not a lot into lamb and ewe diets. And it's a function of how much capacity they have, rumen capacity as well. Like cattle with way bigger rumen capacity certainly have a lot higher tolerance for feeding more urea too.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
Another one on protein. Do you have any comments on using protein tubs when your hay quality is lower?
Sure. Like one of the great things about protein is, like I said, if you got a forage that's not like the energy value of it's okay, but it's lacking protein, they're not going to eat enough, right? And if you add protein in the system, it improves the digestibility, it feeds up the rumen function, and they'll actually eat more. So you can utilize it on longer pastures, like older pastures, longer because of doing it. Great stuff on mature animals on older pastures. I think it's a great idea. The only comment on tubs, of course, is that you're paying for convenience. Like the cost of the protein in there is lots, right? But it's convenient and easy to feed. Same rules on the urea though. Like be careful of how much urea is in it. And what source of urea? I guess I didn't really say there's actually a couple different sources. There's another product called Burette, which is a nitrogen source, but it's a slower release source. So you can actually have more Burette in a tub and be okay than straight up actual urea.
That makes sense.
Did I answer that question? Yeah, I think so. So yes, I love tubs. I sell tubs, but they're costly protein, but they're nice convenience. How about that?
That sounds about right.
Okay.
A couple questions on mineral. If you can't get a goat specific mineral in your area, what's the next best?
Cattle. Like interestingly enough, I yapped about copper stuff on lambs, but I didn't really say goats actually have a regular to a little bit higher copper requirement. And it's certainly dependent on the variety and the amount of hair and stuff they grow. And copper and zinc's pretty related to the hair growth. So cattle mineral is as close to goats as possible. The only real difference is that the requirements on goats, like generally a mineral made for cattle is made for a higher feeding rate than what goats actually require in the feeding rate. But then goats eat way less than what cattle do. So all requirements are in milligrams per kilogram of dry matter. So a cattle mineral formulated for 100 grams with pretty high levels of trace minerals, eaten like 20 grams by a goat meets the requirements quite nicely. So my short answer is cattle. Not sheep. Like they do have a copper requirement. So a sheep mineral without copper is not the best for goats.
And sort of related to that copper thing, if you're not feeding grain at all, is copper toxicity still something you need to worry about?
Yeah.
And if, yeah.
Yes. Well, I guess qualified if you're not feeding any grain at all or any mineral with copper in it, then the answer is no. It's not. But if you're feeding a mineral that's got copper in it, then yes, it's still a concern.
Right. If you're all in the same pasture with cows and there's cow mineral out there, you better watch.
That would make me a little nervous. Yeah, for sure. Like interestingly enough, like it's probably not up in the Peace Country yet, but in some areas, the amount of copper fertilization that's going on in cropland is getting to be more and more because the old crop boys are covering the world of trace minerals, right? Mm-hmm. So it makes you nervous for down the road if the copper levels start to build in forages. Some routine forages could start to get too high in copper for sheep. Then we would probably start looking at situations where actually supplementing a mineral with quite a bit of molybdenum in it, which is possible to do, but we would supplement the molybdenum in order to cut down on the copper, tie it up. Yeah, so.
That makes sense. One thing to note, I don't know how many of our listeners tonight are from the Peace Country, but we do notice that the Peace Country is generally, our forages are generally low in copper but for cows.
Yeah.
So that's something to be aware of, is that
we
do generally have lower.
Yeah, and I think that's still a pretty good statement across Alberta, that they're still generally low, but futures, depending on how much they fertilize it, it could not be the case anymore. Yeah.
Test your feed, then you'll know.
Yeah, and I think in general in the Peace Country, the protein in the forages are actually lower too.
That's probably true.
Numbers, yeah. So is it a soil, is it nitrogen fertilizer or what? I'm not sure. Is it, well, forage is basically it's stage of maturity when cut, right?
Yeah.
If you cut them later, they're going to be lower in protein. If you cut them earlier, they're going to be higher in protein and higher in energy. And of course, that's always a balancing act against the volume you require, right? But for straight up quality, cut them earlier.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's a good one about parasites. How do you feel about grazing sheep and goats together for the parasite side of things?
Oh, man. Well, I think that was when you talk grazing, the lower to the ground is where the worms live. So the closer to the ground it gets, the more higher possibility they're going to pick up the parasites, eh? A little bit of stuff I was reading is talking about, well, okay, sheep have been grazing lower to the ground for a long time, so maybe they're building up a bit more immunity against the worms, which is possible, right? Goats, being they were browser sort of idea, maybe have not picked up as much immunity to the worms. So if you make them graze lower to the ground, they're going to pick up the worms, and maybe it's going to be harder on them because they haven't got to develop immunity. Quality wise, yeah, I don't know. I would almost think goats would probably pick more of the top of the plant off and maybe the more nutrition stuff. So if you want performance in goats, turn them in and have them graze off the tops of the stuff more so, and maybe the sheep after for the lower parts. I don't know.
Fair enough.
But would I recommend a specific goat and sheep pasture? Probably not. No. Well, try to keep goats in the pasture, I guess, would be the other fun part. Anyway.
Yep. One note I have just from one of PCBFA's research guys is for parasite control. Actually, if you can get some forage that's got tannins in it, so that'll be your low bloat legumes, and I believe there's some shrubs and that sort of stuff that have got higher tannins in them. Those tend to be okay for parasite control. I don't want to say they're really good or anything, but they have been shown to have some anti-parasitic.
Tannins do, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've learned something.
Right on. Yeah, so they're just they don't completely control them, but they can help render certain stages ineffective, and then
okay,
they'll pass. So
well, there's all sorts of like adaptations and stuff that occurs, right? That's what's so interesting about the ruminant is the adaptation that occurs and why it works so well together, and how has that all evolved is all quite a question. So I'm sure there's lots of stuff that works together that we don't really know about or will learn about, hey?
Yep. Okay, I have 3 more questions. Quick one. Are those Coccidiostats like Rumensin and Decox and that sort of stuff? Are those safe for horses or dogs to get into? That
would be a no.
Yeah.
Outside of the decox is okay, but no, big warnings: do not feed the equines, donkeys, dogs. No, don't do that. It's toxic to them. Any feed label with the product in it has quite a list of warnings against that. Yep.
All righty. Another question. Do you have any thoughts on Teff hay?
On what, sorry?
Teff hay. It's I think Teff grass is what they're thinking, and it's got a 14% protein on it.
That sounds pretty good. What are the fiber values on it? Because I do not know.
We'll see if they can send us that info.
Yeah, like the 14% protein sounds pretty good. I guess even when you're old, there's something to learn. Teff hay. Is that what how it's spelled?
Yeah, just TEFF. It's I used to know what species of grass it is, but
well, that's beyond the ruminant nutritionist's capabilities when he doesn't know about pastures. Not all plants are meat, yeah. But the 14% protein sounds good. I would be interested in the fiber values. Like most forages, like most times what the limited nutrient in the ruminant is energy. And the equations for predicting energy value of forages come from the fiber values. So that's why I look at fiber and it tells me how good of a forage it is. Basically ADF, NDF is what they're classified as fiber values. So that's acid detergent fiber, not digestible on an acid. So it's kind of like the stomach. So it tells you what proportion of the forage is not going to be digested in the abomasum. And then there's the neutral detergent fiber, which is basically the amount of forage that's not digested in the neutral, which is the rumen. Cole's Notes version, the lower the values, acid detergent and neutral detergent fiber on a forage sample, the better the energy value of the sample is. So if you talk about alfalfa hay, what they call prime alfalfa hay is 20% protein, 30% ADF, and 40% NDF. So anything lower than 30% ADF or 40% NDF is better, higher energy, and anything higher is worse, lower energy. So on the Teff hay, I would be looking at what the fiber values of it and giving you an answer from there. Typically, if it's a grass, so 14% protein in a grass is typically fairly immature, so the fiber values would be lower, would be my guess at it.
Yeah.
So
I did do a
better.
quick Google on it. It's a warm season, so that's why it's higher protein.
Okay. So does that mean it does not grow so well in the north, or what does that mean?
It'll grow. I know PCBFA has done some research on it. I don't have the information right handy here, but I know we've grown it up here.
Okay.
And stuff like Prozo millet, which is also a warm season, does really good up here. So
Okay.
it's possible. Probably depends on your soil and your weather in your specific area and all that
So
stuff.
it's just like growing forage every year does, yes.
Exactly.
What is the ideal forage, Jamie? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a
Tell me what the year's
local.
gonna be like. Yeah.
That's a local forage association question. They'll tell you it depends.
Yeah. No, after 30 some years, that is my answer. Whatever one you happen to cut the best, the earliest, and not get rain, and it comes and analyzes back with the lowest fibers and the highest protein. That's the one. Just find it.
Yeah. So they got a 47.1 on their NDF.
Yeah, that's pretty good for grass. Like grass, kind of prime grass will test. It'll do 20% protein as well, done early enough. And then it's usually a 30 ADF and a 50 NDF is usually kind of the prime kind of grass. So a 47 NDF is probably pretty good stuff.
Right on. All righty. Here's a follow-up to the protein lick question. Have you got any thoughts on mineralized molasses? They're feeding it in a rollerball tank.
Oh, so like a lick tank? So this is molasses with some mineral suspended in it and then lick. Yeah, like the amount of mineral they can get into molasses is a little bit depending on separation issues and that, right? You start to put a lot into it, it'll sort out, so then you need some sort of agitation system to bring it back into suspension again. Palatable, obviously, yes. And then I just have to look at what the levels in the tag, or what the levels in the product are, and then of course it's how much do they eat. Because we talk about requirements for trace minerals. It's very much like all that, well, all mineral kind of nutrition is very much what I call the Goldilocks thing, where it has to be just right. Like too little's no good and too much can be no good as well. So you have to look at the tag and know what the intake of it is. Just because it's high doesn't mean it's great if they eat too much. But overall, probably more expensive than what some of the dry forms are would be my guess.
Makes sense.
Hauling water is expensive. Hauling anything is expensive. Freight is a killer now. So if you got a bit of water and stuff, I assume it makes it more money to haul it around.
Yep. Say, do you have a cheat sheet for trace mineral requirements for sheep and goats?
Like I could make one. I didn't. Yeah, I'm sure in the nutrient requirement book that we sort of looked at there's trace mineral requirements in there for sheep and goat. The only thing you have to be cautious of when you're looking at an NRC is usually they're kind of minimal requirements within an ideal system. So we put what's called a safety margin on them. But just off the cuff, if you think about zinc, I usually feed like 50 to 60 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter. The manganese requirement is very much the same, but if you look at a lot of our forages, the manganese is actually higher than the zinc in a lot of cases. So that's why we feed like 40 of manganese. Copper, 0. Goats, somewhere around 15 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter is what we would feed for copper. And these things change depending on like there's a couple of things that really affect trace minerals. One is sulfates, sulfur. So sulfates in the water can really change some trace mineral requirements, but it's more about that makes some of them more unavailable. And then the molybdenum that I was talking about can have an effect on goats and cows and stuff if the molybdenum gets too high. And then we can go into conversations about trace mineral types if we want, like the organic versus the inorganic, but
right.
We'll see if there's a question there on that.
Yeah.
So did I answer it? I've got a cheat sheet in my head, probably written down in NRC.
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't mind to build one, I can send it out here in a couple of weeks, but
Sure.
or even if you run across a link to something that's close, you can just send that along to me and I'll share it with everybody.
Yeah, I would have them.
Right on.
Do you want the rest of them on here? So selenium is 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter. Iodine's 0.6 and cobalt's 0.1. That's all milligrams per kilogram of dry matter.
Yeah. Oh, here's one that I forgot earlier. Do you have any difference when feeding rolled or non-rolled grains for uptake?
As in how they eat it?
Yeah.
No. Like my only, like when you're rolling grain, if you get it too fine, they're not a big fan of the fine, so they might back off a bit due to that. The whole grain and the pellet, the whole seems to actually work better because the size of the barley and the size of the pellet's pretty similar. Whereas if you could differentiate the sizes on stuff, they tend to sort it more. The only qualification that I would have on whole grain and sheep or goats in general, well, I guess I said the goat thing are too big as orders, but in sheep is the ewes have to have teeth. Like if they haven't got teeth, they're older ewes with no teeth, then they're not going to do too well on whole grain either, and you'd have to process it in that case. They have to chew it in order to utilize it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So if they're old, I would process it. Yes.
Perfect. All right. 2 more mineral questions. Do you have an effective way to offer copper to your goats on pasture? Any recommendations that
An
way?
effective way. Oh man. A free choice mineral that they'll eat, and there is a secret to making them eat free choice minerals, right? Like lots of stuff in the free choice mineral is not the most palatable stuff in the world, so we tend to put some carrier with it, often in the form of corn distillers or ground grain or whatever, in order to get them to consume it. Now the thing with free choice in general is that it's a crapshoot. Like you can do the math and say, I've got so many head and I put out so many kilograms, and per head, they want 20 grams per head per day. And you can do the math to see that they eat it, right? If they don't eat any of it, then it means that you probably need to put a carrier of some sort in it in order to increase the palatability. And lots of times you can vary the amount of carry you're putting in there just to make them eat it, right? You can get them to eat more or less just depending on what you're putting in there. And I guess the other one that really has a bearing on intake is salt content. Like basically salt's about the only thing that we know ruminants have a craving for. So you'll use salt to drive intake up on minerals, but if you put enough salt in it, it'll actually sort of back them off. So it can be used to enhance or to slow them down depending on the salt level you have in it. The only thing that really complicates salt in a mineral is if you've got like high sodium in your water, then they really haven't got the craving for the salt, and then you're back into putting more and more carry into the goats. I don't know too much about it here, but I know there is actually some trace mineral boluses around as well. I think they're more popular in Europe and other places where they'll have a bolus full of trace minerals that you'll put down their throat, and then it slow releases into the rumen over periods of time. So I know there is such a thing, but what rate they pay out at and all that sort of fun stuff, I don't know. But I didn't know it before I did it.
Makes sense. And you alluded to it just now, but hard water affects nutrient requirements and mineral uptake and all that sort of stuff. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so hard is in like high sulfate levels. Sulfate's really quite the antagonist when it comes to trace minerals. It'll bind them up and carry them out of the system and not make them digestible. So if you got really bad water problems that are doing all sorts of stuff with the trace minerals, that's when we get into conversations about organic trace minerals. Normally inorganics are things like zinc sulfate, copper sulfate. So it's a zinc ion attached to a sulfate, and it's inorganic. It dissociates in the rumen and then is absorbed by its original iron. If you got too much stuff tying it up and not making it available, that's where the organics come in. And what an organic mineral really is a zinc or a copper attached to an amino acid or a protein. So you got zinc methionine, for example. And what really changes is that then it's absorbed as a protein. So the interactions from the sulfates and stuff do not affect it anymore. And that's why it's said to be more bioavailable, because it's absorbed by a different pathway. What levels? I don't know, like most of the stuff over the years, you see problems with some trace minerals that you can't explain because they eat what they should, and it's supposed to have in the mineral what it should, and yet you're still seeing some things on animals that aren't right. And that's when I get more excited about the organic trace minerals.
That makes sense.
But water is definitely important. What's in the water is definitely important, yes.
Yeah. All righty. I think we got one more question, and then it's going to be 8:30, and we'll call her a night there. And this one is just quick. Do you have any thoughts on pasture usage for parasites?
As in trying to have fewer parasites, I assume?
Yeah, and rotating and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, I think it would make sense if rotational grazing, if you had your pastures a little bit higher and didn't graze them as close to the ground, you should reduce the amount of parasites that they pick up. But I think overall in small ruminants, parasites are a problem. We're going to have to worm them. Is kind of what I think. I think they pick them up and they need deworming at some point in the cycle for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't know, like, is there compounds you can spread on pasture that reduce them? Likely there is, but I haven't did the research in order to know if that's a thing or not. But it would be interesting. Can you spread something on the pasture to reduce the worm load? I think the answer is probably there's something out there.
I'm sure somebody's done something with it.
Yeah, but what effect it has on the pasture itself would be a good question. Yeah.
Well, and what effect it has on the good bugs?
So
you need the good bugs to grow the plants. So
I think you got my conclusion of I don't really know that. That was my final answer on that question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I know we are doing PCBFA is hoping to start a project on parasite control in sheep, actually up here with tannins. So,
And I don't know if it's ever been done, but I know I've got some cattle guys, like I've never done it in sheep, but I've got some cattle guys where lungworm becomes a really bad problem. And it's usually, lower pastures and that sort of thing. And we actually have quite successfully put a wormer called fenbendazole or safeguard into mineral and calculated them out and wormed them that way on pasture. Now, I think you can probably do the same thing for sheep, but of course, I'd have to look in the good old MIB and see if it's registered or not. But a lot of these, like I assume it's probably like a lot of the products now, like Rumensin, Decox, Bovatec, all that are actually a lot easier to deal with now that they changed the antibiotic rules, because they've made them all OTC, so over-the-counter products. So you can actually physically go in and buy them from a feed mill in their pure form. As long as you take whatever quantity they come in, you can go in and buy them and utilize them that way. So safeguard, I think it's probably the same. I just don't know what the thing on the rules are. Like, I think I could probably sell safeguard straight out too. And then you calculate how much mineral you're eating and how much you require and mix it in the mineral. But
right.
probably with sheep, there's a crumble you could feed out that would probably take it out of them too, because you wouldn't have to feed a lot. Where cattle, you got to feed a lot, and it's a pain.
All righty. I see in the chat someone says that Texas has done some research with copper boluses in sheep for parasite control. So I will be looking that up later.
Copper boluses in sheep for parasite control. Interesting. Now,
Yeah.
I assume it wasn't that all the sheep died and parasites weren't a problem anymore. So that would be interesting to look up.
Yeah. One other quick question. Talking about water quality. Water with high iron and manganese. Any notes there?
Oh yeah. Well, I said sulfur was bad, but iron's also a bad. Like, iron's classified as like good stuff's called antioxidants, bad stuff's called pro-oxidants, and iron's actually a pro-oxidant, so it does some bad things like creating free radicals and stuff within cells. So high iron content, yeah, would not be good for trace mineral nutrition as well. Too high of iron would have all sorts of interaction. Manganese, anything that's high would have interactions, but manganese probably means that you technically wouldn't have to supplement as much manganese. So if you went for the custom mineral formulation, you could take the manganese out of it, likely is what that means. But that's probably also true depending on what the manganese level in your forage is. But and then it's how high, right? Like iron's high in everything, right? All forages are really higher in iron, so iron's high to begin with. We don't supplement iron. Yeah.
No.
So if you see a mineral that's got iron on the tag, it's not actually added. The phosphorus source has a fair bit of iron in it, so that's where it comes from.
All righty. Oh, all right. We'll call this the last question, and then if you have more, you can shoot Jamie an email, or you can respond to me or any of that sort of stuff later on. But copper boluses to goats. I know you sort of mentioned it's a thing in the EU and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I don't think they're just copper. I think they're like trace mineral boluses that happen to have copper and stuff in them. Yeah, like I think it would work fine. I just would like to know what levels are in there and what's the payout on it and what factors affect the payout of it, I guess would be what my questions would be. I know the like the most common bolus that we talk about nowadays is the Rumensin bolus that we stick in dairy cows and stuff, trying to prevent ketosis. Works really well. I think they got a good handle on what the payout of it is, so we know how many days it lasts, basically. The problem is that we do see them spit up in the alley and that sort of stuff. So that's the downfall. Remember, heavy stuff goes into the reticulum, and if they happen to get up and spit out, well, there goes your bolus, eh? But maybe they've thought of it and got the weight of it that it doesn't go to the bottom of the reticulum and it floats into the rumen and all that sort of thing. Could be.
Yeah. Jody here in the chat says 2 grams copper oxide for kids for 50 pounds.
And that's what the boluses have?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, well, it's probably fine for kids or for lambs, I guess. Copper oxide happens to be a product that the availability of it's basically zilch. It's kind of like red iron oxide where the availability is zilch. So I guess you could feed that as a copper source to lambs, and if the availability is terrible, means that it doesn't dissociate and it just passes out at copper oxide, then you're obviously not going to hurt them. We, within the feed industry, we wouldn't use any copper oxide in our minerals because we know that the availability is terrible. Price is reasonable, but availability terrible. So copper's always copper sulfate. So that would be my comment when I hear copper oxide.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so used for parasite control in goats. We know that there's some research on it.
Is copper oxide toxic to work with? It could be. Like I don't know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that either. I'll have to do some Googling after we're done here.
It's always nice when you can go away from a talk with more questions to answer yourself than you gave to the people, eh? But yeah, good.
There you go. Alrighty, I think we will call it there. As I said earlier, yeah, if you want to, if you come up with any questions after we're done, or your question got lost in the chat, feel free to contact Caitlin or Jamie or myself.
45 questions in the chat there.
Yeah, and
yeah, you see my paraphernalia there. The Caitlin, or sales rep up there. That's her contact information, and then there's my contact information.
Yeah, and I will send out the recording here. And I did grab. Jody took notes when you were listing off your trace mineral knowledge there, so I did take notes there. So
yeah, well, send it back to me and see if I still believe it or not. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll get that double checked and send it out. So sure. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and
I hope you learned something. I hope I wasn't too boring, and thanks for having me. Good night.
Right on. Night, everybody.